Well, good evening. Good evening. Welcome to, this is the fifth session, I guess, of the series we've been doing, Faith, Science, and Reason. We'll welcome you, especially if this is the first one that you've been to. I know that this is probably a topic that has interest. If you weren't interested in some of the other ones, well, then maybe this is the topic about evolution. And you've wondered what it is that the church has said about it and what we perhaps should believe about it. As we begin we begin everything we do as people of faith with prayer. So, as all the other times, we've begun with an ancient form of prayer called Lectio Divina. And it's basically a kind of praying with the Scriptures. Asking the Holy Spirit first, spending time reading the Scripture, and then meditating what exactly is our Lord trying to tell us. We respond to it, respond to Him in prayer, and then we spend time in silence listening for what He has to say, and then we finish by ending in some praise. So, the scripture that we're going to use is the gospel for this Sunday, second Sunday of Lent. So as we begin, let's first ask the Holy Spirit to enter our hearts. Come, Holy Spirit, help us to be able to understand the great mysteries that you present to us, the mysteries of the faith, the mysteries of the world that you have created, that we may better come to understand you and the Father and Jesus Christ. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain, apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no fuller on earth could bleach them. Then Elijah appeared to them along with Moses, and they were conversing with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus in reply, "Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He hardly knew what to say. They were so terrified. Then a cloud came, casting a shadow over them. From the cloud came a voice, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone, but Jesus alone with them. As they were coming down from the mountain, he charged them not to relate what they had seen to anyone, except when the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what rising from the dead meant. So we spend a moment to reflect on what our Lord might be speaking to us through this gospel passage. One thing that comes to my mind is that the disciples go with Jesus up the high mountain, this place of intimate meeting of God. They come up out of the regular mundane tasks of the world to spend time in prayer, and that's where Jesus is revealed to them in great glory, a glory that prepares them for the things that are to come here at the end of Lent and preparing for Easter. Spend now responding to this passage in prayer to our Lord. And then we spend a moment just listening for his response. We conclude this brief time of prayer with praise using the psalm for this Sunday. And I'll read the verses and have you all respond with the refrain. So I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living.
I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living.
I believed even when I said, I am greatly afflicted. Precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his faithful ones.
I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living.
O Lord, I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your handmaid. You have loosed my bonds. To you I will offer sacrifice of thanksgiving, and I will call upon the name of the Lord.
I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living.
My vows to the Lord I will pay, in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the house of the Lord, in your midst, O Jerusalem.
I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living.
So that was just a very brief time for actually doing Lectio Divina. Of course, each of those steps we would spend a lot more time reflecting with the scriptures. But since we're here for this presentation, we'll move into the presentation on the church and evolution. And kind of the background of this is that for myself, kind of the first kind of questions and wondering about how evolution and our faith, it goes all the way back to in high school. There was one time I was in CCD and the kind of question came up, and the answer that was given back was not satisfactory to me. So that kind of stayed in the back of my mind for a while, and then I went to college and I was studying physics in college and had a lot of those kind of questions from other friends. I had a number of friends who were very faithful Christians, but a lot of them were more kind of fundamentalist, and so a lot of them held very, very strictly to a literal interpretation of things in the Bible, and so these kind of questions came up with evolution. And there were many questions, the things that I would read that weren't fully satisfactory to me. Either they were, if they tried to hold up the science, then they would deny things from the theology. Or if they tried to uphold our faith, then they would deny things from the science. And for me, that wasn't intellectually satisfying. And so slowly over time, I began to look more into it. And then I had an excuse to study it more when I was in the seminary and had to write a master's thesis. And I ended up doing my master's thesis on it. So there's a few copies of the book at the back if you're interested in the whole thing. So it's like 156 pages or so. So I've condensed that into this talk. So a lot of this comes from the working out of this master's thesis. So this is the first time I'm very excited because this is the first time I've really had to been able to present this material to a more general audience. I've presented it to the professors that worked with me, but this is the first time I've been able to actually present a lot of the fruits of the research, so I'm very excited to be able to do this tonight. Just to let you know kind of what I'm not going to be doing tonight, I'm not going to tell you whether or not biological evolution actually happened. I'm not going to make a judgment on whether it's true or not because I'm not a biologist. And I'm here as theology, and we're going to look, well, is it, so many say that they're not compatible. So we're going to see, is it compatible, and then also see, well, what ways might it actually lend itself to support what we believe in faith? Does it help us to see the world in a way that supports what we believe in as faith? And of course, I'm not going to pretend like I'm going to answer every question here in this presentation. I probably won't. I'm sure there'll be many questions that you'll ask me, and if there's questions that I don't know the answer to, I apologize, but I'll try finding the answer. We're always learning more. So this is kind of the outline, introduce things. We're going to go briefly and talk a little bit about what exactly is evolution, biological evolution, to be specific. That way we're clear of exactly what we mean by evolution, because a lot of times that word is thrown around and it means a lot of different things to different people. And then we're going to look at the church's response, which basically can be broken down into four main areas that it responds to when it deals with evolution, and it's in a lot of the documents. And then we're going to apply those four areas to address some of the, kind of get more into the nitty-gritty, but go beyond what the church has said into looking at, okay, how do we apply this to these areas? So when we get into there, a lot of that is not actually official things that the church has said. So if you disagree with things in that section, that's perfectly fine, because it's not something that you're required to believe what the church has said. And then we'll conclude after that. So why is this important? Well, I guess you guys think it's important. You're here. I think one thing that could really show us the importance is this graph here. This is the percentage of the population around the world who believe in evolution, according to this survey. If you notice, so here's Iceland up here with over 85%, and there's the United States, way on the other end, at about 40%. So as you can see, there's some different opinions in our country, as I'm sure you've probably come across. So that's kind of how the world looks. What about Catholics here in the United States? Well, there we are, compared with other religions, about 58. So this is percent of who agree that evolution is the best explanation for the origins of human life on Earth. So it says 58% of Catholics think it is the best explanation for origin of human life. So you can kind of see the different religions and what percentage of them in the United States actually agree. So those you can't see over here. So you got Catholic here, mainline Protestant here, evangelicals. So there's a wide, even at 58%, that means there's still quite a bit of difference in what people believe. And I think the kind of limitation of this study is that the way the question's asked. They didn't really ask it in a way in which you can bring both of them together. So some may not answer positively with this because they would answer more on God's side. And that's kind of what it found, that across all of these religions, those who are more highly committed tended to be less likely to believe in evolution, if you're more highly committed to your religion. So if we tonight want to be committed to our religion, what does that mean? We can't believe in evolution? Well, we'll talk about that. So when you hear about it talked about in the media, these are probably the three you hear about the most. So you've got atheistic Darwinism, so it's kind of used as support for the belief that God doesn't exist or we don't need a creator. And then you got on the other side creationism, where they reject evolution almost as a whole and say, no, we have to follow what the Bible says. And then you've got intelligent design, which is kind of something in between. It's kind of they claim to be an alternate scientific theory. But there's more. Here's a couple other ones that you probably don't hear about as much. But for tonight, I am not going to be so concerned as to, we're not necessarily wanting to place ourselves in one of these. What we're interested in, as always, is truth. We want to know the truth because a lot of times labels can help or can fold together truth and falsity. And so we want, perhaps people who are atheists, they've got some truth to share. Perhaps those who are creationists, they've got truth. So all of those can have truth, but yet they might have falsities mixed with them. And so what we want as Catholics is, we know all truth comes from God. So it doesn't matter where we draw it from. If it's truth, it's going to lead us to God. And so that's kind of what we want to sort through. It's not really necessarily hold on to certain labels, but find out what exactly is the truth. So I think those labels can lead to some of that misunderstanding that we have. Because we're like, well, I don't want to be in that one, I don't want to be in that one, and so where do I belong? I think another area where some misunderstanding and confusion comes from is from what Pope John Paul II said, or was supposed to have said. He did say that evolution is more than a hypothesis. And in his address to the Pontifical Academy of Science in 1996. So he did say that. But you get some people blowing that out of proportion and almost making it as, see, the Catholic Church now teaches evolution, which we'll see that's not quite the case. In fact, so that first one, formally accepted evolution as a fact, not a hypothesis. Well, that's a little bit stronger than what he said. And then in my research, this one author even misquotes the Pope and says that he said it was more than a theory. So I'm not sure where he got that. So you can understand that they held on to this one phrase out of the context to the rest of what he said. So this doesn't mean that the church accepts everything that deals with evolution. Evolution is very broad. We have to look at it very specifically. More than a hypothesis basically means that he said it's a theory, which, I mean, yeah, it's a scientific theory, which is not to demean it and say that it isn't important or it doesn't have a lot of facts supporting it, but he's to say, I mean, it's in the mainstream of science, is basically what he's saying. But he also mentioned that you have to be careful when you're telling people, when you're talking about evolution, because he said there's multiple theories, even within the science, and then it also goes beyond science sometimes. And that's sometimes where you get to versions of it that are not compatible with the faith. And so he specifically mentioned that not all versions are compatible with the faith. So when we deal with people saying, well, see, the Pope says it's perfectly fine. Well, depends upon what version you're talking about. All right. So I think one of the very important things of why it's important for all of us to know something about this is because creation is very important for us in our faith. I mean, we believe that God is the creator of everything. We believe that that's basically the start of our whole salvation history. And there had been kind of a disemphasis on talking about creation because, well, we didn't want to get put into maybe a fundamentalist type camp. We didn't want to be seen as being unintellectual. So there might be a certain fear of talking about that we believe that the world was created, which we do. In fact, it's a foundational thing. So Ratzinger, now Pope Benedict, says that we must not conceal our faith in creation. So I'm hoping that a presentation like this helps you to not be afraid to conceal that faith, or not be afraid not to let out your faith, and show forth that you do believe in creation, and that it's not something, that we have to throw away now because of what we see from science. All right. For those of you who are here for this session that I had on Scripture, these are some truths that we learned about creation that are going to come into interaction with what we talk about tonight with evolution. So man being created in God's image and likeness. That when he was done, when that happened, that means he has a spiritual soul. He was created in right relationship with God, and that evil only entered afterwards through an abuse of that freedom. And this abuse of freedom was a personal act, a personal choice by first parents. And as a result of that, death and suffering came into the world for them, but there's still hope for a resurrection given. So these are kind of the things that there's certain aspects of evolution will challenge, or will seem to challenge. So, in order to see how or why it might challenge, we've got to know what it is. So, we'll give a little. I'm not going to pretend this is going to be exhaustive, because it's not. So there's plenty more about evolution that we won't talk about. So, as always, science begins with observation of the world. So, we look out in the world and we see different things, different living creatures, a lot of diversity. But we also see similarities. That one looks kind of like this one, but there's certain differences. So that's the first kind of observation that we make. We see this not only with things that are living right now, but we also notice it between things that are living now and things that have lived in the past. There's things that are same and different. So it does that through time. And we also observe short-term change with the creatures, the animals, the plants that we see around us. Within a population, you have, like, say, a population of horses. Some of them will have different characteristics. So you see short-term changes as they go through time within a population. So, but we also see some kind of long-term change, because when we look and we see we look at the evidence from past creatures, they look different from the ones that we have now. So some change had to have occurred over time, because there's certain animals that were living in the past that we have evidence for that aren't alive now. There's certain animals or plants that are living now that we don't have any evidence that they existed in the past. So that's kind of objective evidence that we have to deal with. So the question is, well, how do you put all this together? what's a framework to make this understandable? Well, before Darwin, there were plenty of naturalists who were dealing with these kind of questions. So here we've got Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He actually had the idea first that all species were derived from other species, and that they would go from simple to more complex. Now he didn't go into how that would happen, what kind of mechanisms or things would cause it that from go to one. But there was that idea. There's a connection between things in the past and the future. So that's his inference that he makes from the changes that we see now, kind of a microevolution, and the changes that we see across long periods of time, macroevolution. So let me explain what those terms mean. So microevolution is basically the changes that occur within a population of animals. So we can see that happen. We know that there's a variety within a population of horses or fruit flies or whatever, that there's differences between those creatures, and they change over time. A macroevolution is a change that occurs from one species to another. One thing to note is that microevolution is necessary for macroevolution to occur, but microevolution alone isn't sufficient enough to make macroevolution happen. So there's more mechanisms have to be thrown in there in order for that to happen. So just because we observe microevolution doesn't necessarily, it's not an automatic thing. Just pointing that out. So we move to Darwin and his natural selection theory. And so this is basically what you would think of when you think of evolution. So he begins with 3 observable facts. So he begins with the fact that species, or a single species, they have the opportunity to increase in population. So they can create more offspring, and they can increase. But he also observed that most populations remain stable, and that there's only a certain number of natural resources for that population, and that's kind of affected their how they would remain constant. So from those facts, he made this inference that all of the individual creatures within a population have to compete against one another for those resources, and some of them are successful and some of them aren't, and so some of them will survive to be able to produce another generation. It's pretty straightforward. So then he took 2 more observable facts, that variation, the diversity that we talked about earlier, and then that characteristics are inherited by the offspring. They're passed down from generation to generation. And so then he made 2 inferences based upon the previous inference, these 2 more facts. So he said that there's certain that individual creatures that have characteristics that help them to survive will survive. Kind of makes sense, right? It's pretty straightforward. So that's what natural selection is. It's that simple. If they've got characteristics that help them to survive, then they will. And by that they're naturally selected. They're selected in a sense by nature. The second one is that over many generations, these changes will build up and produce new species. Now that is the inference that's called descent with modification. So those 2 things, natural selection and descent with modification, basically make up the foundation of what Darwin came up with. Yeah, descent with modification due to natural selection. So here's basically what we got. You've got your diversity here in your beetles, and then you've got natural selection happening. Too bad for the green guy there. And then they inherit the new characteristics, and as you notice, the new ones get a lot more of the brown than they do the green, because the green ones are being eaten. So the brown beetles are naturally selected to carry on their genes to the next generation. So that's basically that's natural selection. And this occurs within a single population. So we can see that kind of thing happening. So that's on microevolution. You see that within microevolution. Then you've got descent with modification. So you've got this original population of beetles, and then they get split apart for maybe it's a river or something splits them. And then they begin to change and become diverse over time. And so this one has a lot of the birds. They eat the green ones, and those don't have the birds. So then over time, they become so different from one another that they can no longer produce fertile offspring. And then, since they can't produce fertile offspring, then they're defined as separate species. So that's descent with modification. Yes. And that is a macroevolution. Doesn't occur within microevolution, but it occurs between species. So it's macroevolution. So we'll first look at the microevolution, because that's where most of the research is done within microevolution, and then it's applied to macroevolution. So for Darwin, he said there's 3 different kinds of traits that can be passed on from one generation to the next. Either it helps, it hurts, or it's neutral for survival. So that kind of makes sense, right? And this is kind of where chance comes in, because Darwin says that what exactly the traits that come up, it's too complex to figure out. And since it's so complex, what we do is we call it chance. So chance basically is a description that it's complex. So it doesn't really explain it, it just describes it. So then, as time went on, we've got Father Gregor Mendel, and he's the father of modern genetics, and he comes up with these unit of inheritance working with pea plants. And basically he's helping to understand what are these traits that are passed on from generation to generation. So the genetics helps when it's combined with Darwin's natural selection theory much later, 1940s, then you get something like this. You can see, many of you, if you've taken biology, you know the Punnett square here. So you've got the traits from one plant and the traits from the other plant produce offspring with differing traits depending upon what genes they pass on. So that's kind of what came in, what we call neo-Darwinian theory. So it brings in genetics into and it places a great emphasis on positive, advantageous variations, also known as synthetic theory, selectionist theory. And then we get to when we get DNA coming into the picture, it moves from neo-Darwinian. It actually remains being called neo-Darwinian, but it brings in the molecular level, and so we can deal with genes as being the units that are passed on from one generation to the next. So, and these genes are the variations that we see are due to mutations in the genes, and there's different ways in which the genes can mutate. I just listed a number of them here and how they work. We don't really need to understand exactly what all those are about, but know that genes do mutate, and so there's different ways in which changes from one generation to the next can happen within the DNA structure. And so that's what came in with molecular Darwinism. And then you had, as time went on, you've got other theories, and they're actually non-Darwinian theories, because they took the emphasis off of natural selection. So natural selection is Darwin's thing. So it took the emphasis off of natural selection. So neutral and nearly neutral theories, they came to think that most changes, most mutations are neutral. They don't really have an effect of whether or not they help the creature to survive. And the thing that those did was basically it put the emphasis greater on chance. So it's just like, well, whatever happens to survive, happens to survive. It kind of went from if Darwin's was kind of the survival of the fittest, there's a certain order there. If you've got advantageous things, it's going to help you survive. But for the neutral theories, it basically was survival of the luckiest. And so you get a great emphasis on randomness, on chance, comes into play when you're dealing with that version of evolution. But that more recently, you've got neo-selectionist theory. So back to going into to having natural selection be important. And so basically, if you look at kind of how it progresses, this newest one kind of combines things from those two. It tries to bring them together. And actually is much more balanced between the two. And so actually it brings things back to being more ordered and less dependent upon just things happening by chance. All right. So here's the, so in this part you've got survival of the fittest, and then it changes kind of, the emphasis is survival of the luckiest, and then it comes back to survival of the fittest. This is very new, by the way. 2006 is very, very recent. So I'm not sure how widespread that last one is in the science community. All right. There's four main things that drive this whole process. Mutation, genetic drift, natural selection, and migration. So mutation, from the parent, when it produces its offspring, the DNA changes in some way. And you might have different genes passed on that are different some way from the parents. And then genetic drift is basically how do those, which parents come together to produce which offspring. So some of them may have a greater chance to produce offspring with others, and some have a less chance. So that's kind of drift. It changes over time. And then natural selection, which of them survive to adulthood. And then migration. Some of them move into the population. Some of them might move out of the population. So those are just the four mechanisms that are used to describe evolution. And that was all on a microevolution scale. So all of that can be observed just somewhat on a microevolutionary scale. But all of that is applied now to macroevolution. And Darwin was really focused mainly on macroevolution. So basically you take those four, mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, natural selection, you add a whole lot of years, and you get macroevolution. It's kind of what it's like. So in order to talk about it, we've got to kind of understand what a species is, and that's easier said than done. As to exactly what a species is, because sometimes it's hard to determine what it is. They know that it's determined by independent gene flow, which is basically whatever ones can produce fertile offspring. If these two creatures come together and can't produce fertile offspring, well, they're not of the same species. So how do you tell? Well, the first one is the kind of the traditional biological concept, where you actually, if they come in contact and can't produce fertile offspring, well, then you know they're of different species. Though they don't always have to be in close contact. You can tell by the way the creature is made whether or not they can. Then there's the phylogenetic species concept, where instead of basing it upon whether or not producing fertile offspring, it's based upon how close they are to one another within the whole kind of the whole phylogeny. Phylogeny is what this thing over here is. So scientists put together, based upon DNA, based upon fossil evidence, they put together what they see as the most likely way in which the different creatures are related to one another. And if the creatures are a certain distance apart on this tree and due to certain traits that are different, then they're defined as different species. And then the third one is the morphospecies, and morpho just basically means the physical characteristics. So this is really used with fossils, where you don't have DNA to work with, you just have the physical characteristics. So the unfortunate thing is that when you use three different ones, they don't always give you the same distinctions between species. So you might have two creatures that are defined as different species here, or here, but they wouldn't be on here. So it kind of brings some confusion in. But unfortunately, you can't use any of these three all across for every creature. They just don't work, because you can't use this one for fossils. All right, so speciation. That's going from one species to another, macroevolution. Basically, the three steps that I showed you earlier. You've got an initial population, like split for some reason. They're isolated from one another, and then their traits change for some reason, and then if they come back into contact, they can't produce offspring. So here's a way to understand it. So we've got these nice family of fruit flies here, hanging out in the banana, and then a flood comes, and they're separated from the rest of the fruit flies over on that island, and they've got a new they're separated. And so then they have families separately, and over time certain changes happen. So you've got red-eyed ones and green-eyed ones, and then another flood brings the bananas back, and so, but now they can't produce fertile offspring with one another, and so they're isolated from one another, and so they're new species. So what causes this? Well, here's some ways in which it could be caused. Geographic isolation. So the bananas are moved across the river. So that's geographic isolation. Also, reduction of gene flow, which basically means you've got a large expanse of this the population of beetles, let's say, is across your entire lawn, and the beetles on one side of the lawn are more likely to reproduce with each other than a beetle on this side and a beetle on this side. So it could be that you start getting the ones that are on one side, you've got green beetles, and the other side become blue beetles. And if they would come in contact with another, they couldn't produce offspring, and so they got separate species. So those are a couple ways in which they say speciation could occur. Evidence for speciation? Well, we can't have direct evidence because it takes way too long. So there's no direct evidence of the entire process. But the scientists do think that they see specific parts of the process going on. So example, these two different kinds of owls in western United States, they're geographically separated. So they think, oh, well, maybe this is the geographic separation stage of speciation. We're seeing these change into two different separate species. So that's kind of one way in which we see it. So this whole process of speciation is used to explain all the way from the origin of life to where things are now. In order to do that, there has to be certain transitions that occurred. The first and probably most important one is where the life came in the first place. Where did that come from? And then every step, even from how do you get from single-cell organisms to multi-cell organisms? How do you go from protists to plants? How do you get from primates to humans? So there's these 8 major transitions, and really we don't know a whole lot about any of them, how any of them occurred. And scientists should admit that. And then about the origin itself, here's an interesting little short clip from an interview that this is Richard Dawkins, biologist, atheist. He's being interviewed by, what's his name? Ben Stein, yeah. This is from the Exposed movie. But it's just interesting that he's being very intellectually honest here when he talks about the origin.
Well, then who did create the heavens and the earth?
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
And what was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, and how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else.
So, I mean, he's being honest. We don't know. So, I mean, that's what good scientists should do, is admit when they don't know. And so a lot of these we don't know exactly how, but just because we don't know doesn't mean that they didn't happen. You know, just because we have a limitation there. But I just want to point out that there is limitations to what we know in the sciences. Then we go to what we all want to know about, I'm sure. What about us? What about, I'm sure you've seen things like that before, all over the place. And see, perfect explanation, right? So we, let's look at that a little closer. So how do we apply this that we've been talking about to man? All right, so we've got, where does the evidence come from? Well, they compare traits between humans and the higher primates, so the ones that are alive now. Also, we look at similarities between the DNA of those higher primates and us now. And then we look at fossils, and we look at how are they physically similar. So here we've got here's some DNA similarities between us and our friends the chimpanzees, and then we've got Paranthropus robustus there, a pre-human, you could say. And the inference is that we've got some kind of common ancestor among us. So through some of the evidence, we put together some of these pre-human fossils. Some of them you've probably heard of, like Australopithecus, maybe you heard of him. Homo habilis, different documentaries and shows, mention these kind of fossils that they have. The data is rather limited, but through the data, what they do is they separate it into basically 14 different species of kind of human-like. And I say human-like because, as we'll look at here in a moment, well, do they know how many are human and how many are not human? All right. So here's a anthropologist who also is being very honest, saying it's the file that we're trying to build with our teeth, bones and teeth is based on anatomy and morphology and is a bit light. So they admit they don't have a lot of evidence to work with, but this is what they come up with best. So where do the humans fit here? Where are we? Well, scientists don't agree where we are. And some of them will point out, well, just because something might look like a human doesn't necessarily mean that it's a human. So this other anthropologist, skeletal remain attributed to the genus Homo, which you can see that goes all the way back to here. So all of those are Homo. Doesn't, because of its anatomic features, does not necessarily imply that it represents man, a thinking person like us. So some of them would say, oh yeah, this is man all the way down here. In other words, would say no, not man until way up there. So scientists don't agree on that. All right. So what about where did we come from? Polycentrism or monocentrism. So one of an earlier theory was that the different peoples throughout the world they had a common ancestor, but a pre-human common ancestor, but they became modern humans separately. So you've got different races of humans that evolved separately from one another. That was kind of an early one, and then more recently, the theory, the out of Africa theory, you may have heard of out of Africa, so that there's basically one regional origin of where humans came from, and then they spread throughout the rest of the world. And so it's actually the second, so this first one is polycentrism, many different places. Monocentrism, one place of origin. And so actually currently right now, Current evidence points towards the latter, the monocentrism, as to being the theory of where man came from. So I point that out because that'll become important later. All right, kind of a summary of this science stuff. So when science deals with this, they're not questioning either of the two things that Darwin came up with. I mean, when we go through all this, those are pretty much things that they all hold to. They hold to natural selection and descent with modification. But there's limitations to the science that we have to remind ourselves of. Those transitions, we don't understand them very well. There's not a lot of observation of speciation. In fact, when I was doing my research through it, I was surprised of how small the section in the textbook was. And then the questions of, can those four mechanisms really explain all the evidence? And there's nothing wrong with saying that there's limitations in our science now. I mean, that's in every area of science. We continue to work and understand more. So I want to, everything that I've talked about here is just the science, nothing more. A lot of times when we hear about it, there's lots of philosophical, ideological things that are added to it. And so I've stripped everything off in what we just did, all of those things. But they're going to come back now. And we're going to deal with those. So, especially when we go to the church's response. So, all the stuff that we just went over, the pure science, if you would, the church has no official position on that. It doesn't teach science. I mean, that's not what it does. So, it doesn't have an official position on it. I mean, if you want to, maybe the only official position it might have is that scientists are encouraged to do scientific research. So on that science itself, it has no official position. But that doesn't mean it hasn't said anything. It's said quite a bit. So let's go back again. There we've got the 1700s with the naturalists dealing with these kind of scientific questions. We've got Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859. And then the first thing that comes up is the First Vatican Council. And some people had hoped that it was going to address evolution, that it would address it. But the church sometimes takes a little bit longer to deal with things. We might want to do things now, but you know, in God's wisdom, it lets things take time. So actually, Vatican I did provide some very important things. It didn't necessarily specifically talk about evolution, but I think it was in a sense in reaction to it. Because one of the most important principles that we've learned in some of our other sessions is that truth cannot contradict truth. And that came from Vatican I. So if there's truth from the natural sciences and there's truth from our faith, the truths come from God, and so they're not going to conflict with one another. So, but the first time that we actually start talking about evolution is Pope Pius XII in Humana Generis in 1950. So that's the first time we see it, and we'll talk about what he said. And then recently we've had a lot from John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Well, that's a lot coming from them. Not a lot of like huge documents on it, but they like to mention bits and pieces here and there about it. So I don't think that's a composite image that I don't think they meant. Pius XII and Darwin. So these are the four areas that the church deals with when it comes to evolution. And so we're going to be working out of these four areas for the rest of this time. So the first area, philosophical and theological truth, basically upholding that science isn't the only way to know something. You could know it through reason and through faith as well. And then we're going to deal with divine providence, God's ordering of the universe and random processes, the uniqueness of the human person, and original sin. So those are the four areas that when the church talks about evolution, it falls into one of those four, at least so far. So, philosophical and theological truth. So science, reason, and theology are all legitimate ways to gain knowledge. And so we talked a lot about this in our very first session, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about this area in this presentation. That way we can get on some of the more fun areas that I'm sure you're more interested in. So, as we're not surprised All three are legitimate ways. The church never condemns science as science, but it does condemn it when it does condemn certain errors when it goes beyond the science. So, for example, there's many ideologies in our history so far that have used these scientific evolutionary conclusions to support their own ideologies. And there's quite a few really bad ones that have. And so that, I think, has maybe one of the reasons why people shy away from it or are afraid of it, of evolution, because it has been taken up by different ones, like communism. And we don't want to have anything to do with these. So we say, well, we don't want anything to do with the evolution either. Well, we shouldn't automatically throw it out because it's been abused, right? There was nothing in that whole section when we were going through the science that really lended itself to say, oh, now we've automatically got to become communists. You know, it just wasn't there. So we don't want any of that. We don't want that. So whenever any of those kind of ideas come into what we're talking about when we're dealing with evolution, we can't accept any of that. All right. But as we talked about in one of our previous ones, Pope John Paul II says in order to really get this faith and the science to work together, we've got to have this wider perception that covers both of them. And so we're really, what we're doing is expanding our reason, as Pope Benedict called it. And that includes, so evolution is a subset of science, natural science, that doesn't overlap with faith unless we use this broader reason. We can understand more through our reason than simply what's scientific. And so that's one of the things. The theory of evolution, Pope Benedict says, sees the truth but sees only half the truth. It does not see behind it is the spirit of the creation. We are fighting to expand reason. So, I told you I wasn't going to spend very long on that. So, summary of everything that they say. There's a lot more that it says. In fact, it says the most in this area. But since a lot of it was covered in previous sessions, and we'll apply some of it coming up as well. Basically, in the main principles to get out of it is that those three are legitimate ways of knowing the world, that science only gives a partial understanding of who man is, and that we need philosophy or reason to act as the wider perception to aid us. All right. So second section about divine providence and randomness. So the question the Catechism points to us, is the universe governed by chance, blind fate, anonymous necessity, or a transcendent, intelligent, good being called God? I think we all believe the latter. So the question is, did it start in reason or unreason? And from the very beginning, his installation homily, Pope Benedict XVI, mentioned evolution, that we're not a meaningless product of evolution, but we're a result of a thought of God. That if we're going to accept anything from evolution, we cannot accept that it began in unreason. That we cannot accept. So if we have to interpret evolution in a light that God is behind everything, that he guides absolutely everything. The other side, we have the consequences really of what would happen to us if we started from unreason. The meaning of what we're all about would disappear. All right, so how do we understand, if we're going to understand evolution in the light of God's providence, how do we understand that? Especially if there's certain things in evolution that seem to be due to chance. Well, whenever we look at chance, it doesn't mean that it can't be unguided. Science may see it as being done by chance because, remember, it was full of these complex causes that they couldn't explain, and so they describe it as chance. But it's not really a full explanation. But we know that God works through natural causes, as we talked about in some of our previous ones, that he has his ordered power, that he works through things within nature, through secondary causes. He's the first cause, and he does things through these secondary ones. And then he has his absolute power, by which he can bring in miracles. But everything that exists, God's is dependent upon God's action. So so for the church, it's impossible for there to be an unguided evolutionary process. It's not possible. So there's an example of God working through secondary causes. That's a painting of Joseph being sold into slavery. So God works through the secondary causes of his brothers selling him into slavery to save them later, by having them save them from the famine by having them come down to Egypt. So that happens all the time in the Bible. So we get examples of God working through secondary causes. So he can do that through nature as well. He can do it in salvation history. So summary of that. So the church says that there's no opposition between a process that science might see as being random and God's necessary involvement, because he's always going to know the causes behind things, even if we don't understand the causes and we call it chance. He's always going to know it. There's no such thing as an absolute chance. All right. Let me go to the uniqueness of the human person. So, we have from the document Communion and Stewardship, the emergence of the first members of the human species represents an event that is not susceptible of a purely natural explanation. So if we're going to talk, you can already see from that, if we're going to talk about human evolution, it's not going to be able to be the same thing as biological evolution. There's going to be a change that comes in. So, the first thing to recognize, science, remember science chooses only to look at the things that are physical. That's that methodological naturalism that it has. It can only look at things that are physical, so it can't see the part of man that's not physical. It can't look at and see that we have souls. But it can look into the human body. And actually, Pius XII, in Humani Generis, says that scientists are welcome to look towards the origins of the human body. But he also points out in there that the human soul could not have emerged just from matter. It has to come by a direct intervention by God, in a sense. An intervention that meaning that it transcends the plain natural causes, doesn't necessarily mean that it's contrary to those natural causes. And John Paul II called this an ontological discontinuity. Sounds really big. Ontological just means being. So, in discontinuity there's a jump from. So you've got an order and then a jump. So, you've got to jump from one kind of being to another kind of being when you get to man. You've got this ontological discontinuity. So, to summarize what the church says in this area is that the person is a union of body and soul. It upholds its use of the philosophical term of nature. We have a human nature, and the nature is kind of that which makes us what we are. The human body can have some connection to previously existing living matter. That's perfectly fine with that. But the spiritual soul has to be immediately created by God. And you can't describe the creation of the soul as a non-disruptive divine intervention. And that's kind of important. It doesn't disrupt the natural course of creation, but it lifts it up, in a sense. And we'll get into that in a little bit, too. All right, evolution in man, then, has to be fundamentally different from when we're talking about animals, right? Because if you're talking about this step where you've got something that's not human, and then now you've got something that's human, there's this discontinuity between there because of the soul. That kind of a step from there to there is much different from what they're describing as to be biological evolution. So if we use the term evolution to describe man, it's fundamentally different from what we mean by biological evolution. All right, then the last area, the funnest area now. Original sin. And from the Catechism, we cannot tamper with the revelation of original sin without undermining the mystery of Christ. I put that on there because so many things that I read tampered with the mystery, with the revelation of original sin. We cannot do that. Because if we do that, hits right there at the center of everything that's important to us, the mystery of Christ himself. So, going back in church documents, we see the sin of Adam is one in its origin and is transmitted by propagation, not imitation. So, it's transmitted from one person to the next through generations. Here from the Catechism, the fall affirms a primeval event that took place at the beginning of the history of man. So there's an event there that happened. It's a real event. The fall is a real event, a choice, where it says that original fault freely committed by our first parents. So it has to be freely chosen. So kind of where the problems comes in is the evolution seems to put into question a first original parent, because it instead polygenism is kind of part of what it puts forth, and says that the origin of man came from multiple sets of ancestors. Well, what can we do about that? Well, in Humana Generis, Pius XII said, "It is not at all apparent how such a view, this polygenism, can be reconciled with the data which the sources of revealed truth and the documents propose concerning original sin." So it's not at all apparent of how polygenism can be reconciled. And many people have tried to interpret that in many different ways. As what does it mean by not at all apparent? You can see it kind of leaves something of an open, it's a negative, right? It's a negative saying that it's not at all how apparent that polygenism could be. But yet, in a sense, it leaves it open that if there would be a possibility of somehow showing how it could be, then it might be okay. But it's not at all apparent how it could. So it's an overall negative on the polygenism. So we'll get more into detail about that. But as it looks from what the church says, it looks like polygenism is not something that's compatible with our belief in original sin. So, original sin has a character of a moral character, of a personal sin. So, man was created good from the beginning. There wasn't any death for man. Having multiple parents doesn't really seem to fit, because the sin is passed on from generation to generation. It has to be a personal sin, so you can't really have Adam be like multiple people. So Adam is this poetic name for many different parents in the beginning. Well, it's got to be a personal sin that's transmitted to all people after him. But we also have to admit our theological limitation, that original sin is not something reasonable. Sin is not rational. So we will never be able to fully understand this mystery of original sin, because the only thing we can understand reasonable things. Sin is not reasonable, so we're never going to be able to fully understand it. That comes from Benedict XVI. All right, so we're going to pause here. That's a lot of material. Do we have any questions? And if you ask questions that we're going to come up with, because what we're going to do now is we're going to apply those 4 areas, and we're going to talk about some of those in more detail.
Is the polygenism the same as the out of Africa theory?
No.
Or the opposite of the out of Africa theory?
That's a good point, because we're going to bring that. I'm going to bring that up and make that clear coming up. Yeah, the first time I talked about it, I talked about polycentrism and monocentrism. So this is polygenism, and they're different. And when we get to that, I'll make that clear as to why they're different. Is that actually both polycentrism and monocentrism assume polygenism. It's assumed by evolutionary theories. But what we'll see is that actually, especially monocentrism, but even polycentrism, are actually open to the opposite of polygenism, which is monogenism. So there's a lot of words in there. I don't know if you caught all that, but we'll get to that part too. But that's a good insight there. Notice the specific differences between terms.
In the Bible it says that death entered into the world when Adam sinned, so how could have all this evolution and death prior to sin?
Excellent. We will get to that one too.
Can't you answer it now?
I could. That take away from later. Okay. Well, part of it has to do with, and that that one bothered me for a long time too, until I really began to understand more about what the church actually teaches about man before he fell. And what the church teaches is that we had what's called the preternatural gifts. And one of those preternatural gifts that was given to us was immortality, not having to die. And that was given to humans alone and not given to anyone else. So in the Bible, we don't know, it says death came in. Whenever it talks about it talks about in terms of human death. So it doesn't, and there actually is instances of death that occur within the scripture before the fall. So we'll come to that in more detail. Mm-hmm.
I don't have any trouble with what you're saying because I sort of along the lines of what I think, but there's one part of the Bible that really bothers me, and that's that Cain is sent out into the world after he kills Abel, and he says, but I'll be killed, and God says, no, I'm going to protect you.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of sounds like he's going to protect him from other humans, but I didn't think there'd be other humans.
Yeah, that's a good question. That actually was even brought up, I think, in the Scopes trial. Was the instance of Cain. Well, and he also says he has a wife, and they want to know where the wife comes from. So, yeah, it depends. It's interesting because someone could interpret the passage either way, as to there's other people or that there's not other people, depending upon their perspective from which they're looking at it. So, basically from that passage, we don't necessarily know what happened. If there was other people around there, we don't, because of what we believe about original sin. It's not at all apparent how we could believe in other people's coming. And that's the term that's used, and so I want to use what the Pope actually has used, so that I don't say something that's different, because that area, and you're going right to the most difficult area of all four areas, because that's the one we all want to know about. We want to know, because it is the most difficult of all four. And unfortunately, the church has said the least amount in that area, because it is the most difficult. And so they have a tendency not to say as much about that. So when we get into that, I'll be giving you a lot of things of perhaps what is reasonable that I've come across so far, but you can take or leave the things that we talk about after the things we've taught, what the church has taught. So from the sections from now on, there's certain things you can take or leave. I would say in that case of Cain going out and fear of being killed, he could be afraid of many things. I mean, he could even be afraid of other people within his own family, because he just killed his brother, right? So they may be wanting revenge from the people who are closest to Abel. I don't know. We don't know for sure. I mean, it depends upon how we interpret it, or how we look at it, which is not necessarily the main point of the passage. The main point really is God is going to, even when we sin majorly like that, God still sees us as a beloved son and daughter, and so he's going to take care of us. And he doesn't desire our death. That's one thing that's coming up through Lent. He doesn't desire our death, but he desires us to repent and live. Mm-hmm.
Not to delay you anymore,
Yeah.
but I don't think anybody back here heard her question, which you've been answering.
Oh, sorry. She asked about, in the Bible, there's a passage where Cain goes out into the world and he's afraid of being killed. And so the question was, who is he afraid of? Is he afraid of other people, and where do they come from? So I would say that it may be that he's afraid of people from his own family, and so he's going off into the world to get away from them. We don't know for sure because we weren't there. And the scripture isn't necessarily focused on that aspect of it either. It's focused more on God desires to protect Cain, even though he sinned. So, any other questions before we go on to some of these? Okay, let's go into some of these. All right, first one. We got some objections in the first area. So, macroevolution proves that God can't exist. Oh, does it? Well, we learned from, this comes from our very first presentation, we learned that science can only study the material world, so it can't make any kind of claims on non-physical things, including God, because of its methodology. So there's no way that macroevolution can disprove God's existence, because it's not within its method to do so. So that's easy. All right, and that's a summary of it on after the slide. So I'm not going to read all the answers, but when it's online, you can go back, and I have the answers on there so that when I'm not there to explain it to you, you can go and read it if you desire to. All right, the next one. Some people will go the other way and say, well, macroevolution is not scientific because you can't test it experimentally. A lot of those things we talked about, all those limitations, we can't actually see it happening. Well, it's not science. We can't test it experimentally. Well, if you remember from our first meeting that we had for some of you who were there, we talked about historical sciences. And evolution will be a type of historical science. What it does, it takes a set of hypotheses, and it chooses out of this set what's the best explanation. And it's a legitimate scientific method. And it's different from experimental methods, because experimental methods are based on taking what's in the present and having to predict what's in the future. Whereas this method is taking present things and trying to figure out what happened in the past. So it's just a different method. So just because it's a slightly different method doesn't mean that it's not scientific. So, and that explains it in a lot of words. All right, so those are the only ones I'm covering in the first section, because we want to get to the more interesting ones. As you guys have already shown, those are the ones you're really interested in. But the thing is that if we don't answer those first ones, then if you're not clear in the first areas, then you're not going to be able to answer things in the latter areas. So the second one, we've got to talk about God's providence and randomness. All right. Well, macroevolution shows the world was created by chance. So there's no design, there's no God, because it's all due by chance. Okay. Well, we got to understand what chance is. I talked about the complexity of things, chance. One way of understanding chance is that it's uncorrelated causal chains that interact in ways we can't predict. So let me explain what that is. So we've got an apple there, and we've got a dog, right? So they act in certain ways, right? Apple grows on the tree, and eventually it gets ripe, and eventually, wind and different things, lots of different causes it to break from its stem and fall to the ground, right? And so we've got the dog. The dog has its dog nature, it does its dog things. That means it goes to different places, it sniffs around, and so let's say these two chains of causes happen to come together, and an apple hits the dog when it falls from the tree. I mean, there's lots of different causes that go there, but that doesn't mean there weren't any causes. So it may have happened by chance, but there was lots of causes involved. We may not have been able to predict it because we couldn't figure out all those causes and tell how they were going to play out. But there's causes there nonetheless. So there's no such thing as something that's absolutely random. So in the same way, to say that evolution is this absolutely random process is not possible. That goes beyond anything science can say. And we learned earlier, the church says, well, God can know all of these causes. So everything in creation is, in a sense, connected to his guiding providence. He may not have this direct... It's through those secondary causes, through the nature of the dog that he gave to the dog, that the dog does what it does. All right, so there's some... You can read that and go back to... That's basically what I was explaining. All right, what about... We can talk about God intervening in things. And so a lot of scientists will bring this up. You Christians, you just talk about God because you're trying to fill in the gaps where science doesn't know the answer. And so you're undermining science by bringing God into the picture. Well, I really don't know any Christians scientists especially, who really do that. I mean, I think it's really a straw man that they throw out there so they don't have to deal with the real issues when they bring that up, that we're making a god of the gaps, because we really don't do that. And those who do should not do that, because we don't need to. God doesn't intervene to destroy the laws that he put into place. And this goes back to what we talked about in one of our previous ones about the interplay between God's absolute power, by which he can produce miracles, and his order power, by which he structures everything that he's made. So we discussed, well, the miracles violate nature. And we learned that no, they don't violate nature, but what God does is he introduces something new, and nature kind of reacts to it and takes it up into it. So God's created both the ordered world, and he creates this kind of miracle, this difference, this new thing in the ordered world. And so whenever he does that, he doesn't do it to subvert what he's made, because they both come from him. So, for example, the Eucharist is a great example. You know, this miracle occurs, but God doesn't destroy the outer, or he doesn't destroy the actual substance. Or the substance changes, but the accidents, the characteristics of the bread don't change, but it does, in fact, become the body and blood of Jesus. All right, so that explains that. Always in this area of, when we're dealing with chance, I think it's important to at least bring up intelligent design, because many people want to know, well, as Catholics, what should we think about the intelligent design movement? And so, obviously, we should believe that the world is designed by an intelligent God. You know, obviously we should believe that. But what about this version called the intelligent design movement? This is something very specific, something that calls itself an alternative scientific theory. And basically, how it defines itself, the Discovery Institute is kind of one of the major organizations that deal with it, is that there's certain things we see, certain complexity within the world that's best described by an intelligent cause and not by an undirected process. And we might agree that, yeah, there's certain things that science is limited in being able to explain. And even, I don't know if I want to take time to show the video clip here, but here's another part of that interview with Richard Dawkins, and he actually admits that certain kinds of intelligent design are actually okay to be used in the sciences. And basically that means if the intelligent designer is something physical contained within the world. So if the designer of something, like for example, a rat running through a maze, eventually he kind of learns how to go so he can do it faster. So there's some kind of rat intelligence, kind of. You know, it's not a human intelligence, obviously, but there's a learning that went on, or something within there. So there's a kind of intelligence there. It's not just by chance that now the rat can do it exactly the way it can. Perfect. So as long as the intelligent designer is within that physical limit, then science can accept it. And that's actually, I think, why we have to be cautious with the intelligent design movement, because if they're saying that they're a scientific theory, they really ought to be remaining within what science is defined as now. And they would argue that point. So there's good things and bad things that come from it. So some of the good things, they want to unify science and theology. That's really good. We want to do that too, in a correct way. It asks a lot of important scientific questions that should be asked, and sometimes people on like the atheistic Darwin side don't want to ask those things. And it points out the limit, because those kind of questions point out the limitations to the current ones that we have, which should really be a good thing, because we want to be able to, you want to make changes to scientific theories as more information comes up. But on the negative side is what it tries to do is it tries to redefine, in a sense, what natural sciences. Its desire is to go back to the older way in which the word science was used, which basically meant knowledge or reason. But that's really not the way that the word has come to be used now. And so it's really difficult to go back to that definition. So they reject the methodological naturalism. But as I understand what John Paul II has said, he wants us to maintain what science is. So we don't want to transform science into something else. So I don't think that that's a helpful thing to do. And actually it's led to a lot of more arguing than actual talking about useful information when it comes to the debate between like the atheist side and the intelligent design people. So, and also it has a tendency to, it focuses on pointing where design is, that here's design, this thing is designed because we can't explain it through a natural means. Well, for us as Catholics, everything in a sense is designed, even if we can explain its causes through a natural means, because everything is controlled by God's providence. And finally, it doesn't claim as to what this intelligent designer is. So it says it could be anything. It could be something in the world, it could be aliens, or it could be God. Well, the problem with that is that the way God designs is fundamentally different than the way in which anything within the world would design something. And so by not making a distinction between the two, there's a problem there. But all right. Third one, human person. All right. Macroevolution shows that there is no such thing as a human soul. What do you think the answer to that is? That's that methodological naturalism again. You know, it doesn't look at that. It can't look at things that are not physical. So there's no way that it can show that there is no human soul. All right. What about, okay, so macroevolution is based on chance. So it shows that there's no purpose. You know, if things just are random, there's no final end, no final purpose. And so therefore, there's no such thing as like a human nature or a dog nature that guides us toward a certain purpose or end. Well, that fails again because chance can never be absolute. Science can't make a judgment on those things because it only looks at physical causes. And as we talked about with the apple and the dog, chance requires that there actually be things there, right? These things that actually have causes behind them. So that might be a little bit more complicated. We're getting into a little bit more philosophical kind of complicated ones. I'm trying to go through as many as I can, so I'm sorry for that. Well, some say, well, okay, if there is such a thing as a human nature or a dog nature, it has to be something physical. And they would say that because they're scientists, and so they would say everything that there is has to be physical. And that's why and since we see physical traits change, these natures have to change, so there's no stable nature, so there's no stable thing that we could call a human or a dog, that they're just changing from one thing to another. But that's a problem because for the same reason is that it's going beyond its what it can do as science. It can't assume that our nature is just something physical because it can't look beyond that. And we know just by observing the world that things that are the same, you know, human beings can all have the same human nature and look very different. And we've got a room right here that proves that, you know. So philosophically, that doesn't hold. All right. So here's a little bit more complicated one, but I think it's very interesting, so that's why I included it. So this is basically an argument from saying that evolution is not possible because you've got one species trying to go to another species, and this one has got a unique nature, and this one's got a unique nature. Well, how does that one produce a new offspring that's something that it isn't? You guys see what I'm saying with that? So you've got, this one thing. When we look at, we'll go to this one. This will demonstrate it. So we've got your amoeba, and then we've got some things happen, and then we go to a fish. You get some more things happening, and we go to a lizard, and then more things. You get the dinosaur, right? So that's evolution. And then, but what we observe is we see a horse, and what does a horse produce? A horse, and what does that horse produce? A horse, and that one a horse, and that one a horse. So we see horses all down the line, and evolution sees that. So we're wondering, well, how do you do that if that's all we ever observe? A horse has got a certain nature, right? So you got horse nature, and that nature produces horses. It doesn't produce these other things. So how do you get from one to the other? That's an important thing that's a big question. So how do you get from the fish nature to lizard nature? What happens in between there? And there's a philosophical term that whenever you go from one nature to another nature, it has to do so immediately, because everything that exists has a nature that makes it what it is. Everything that exists has a nature. So you can't have something that has like half of a nature. Everything is what it is. It's got the full nature. So where is that immediate change? How do you get from the fish to the lizard there? Well, okay. This is kind of like my explanation for it. So, may or may not be right. So, you got daddy horse and mommy horse here, and they both have horse natures. And, of course, when they produce baby horse, they do so through an intermediary, the gametes, the egg and sperm from the parents. And the gametes have gamete nature. They've got their own, they are what they are. And then when they come into contact with one another, suddenly you've got a new nature there. You've got baby horse nature. So, and what happens here when the two come together is you've got this immediate substantial change. You've got from these natures of the gametes, and suddenly you've got horse nature there again. So, we know through science that the gametes in the parents can have mutations that produce slight changes in the offspring that when it produces it. So, this is to show that there on a rational philosophical level, this can be explained. As we're going from a fish to a lizard, you've got a whole bunch of those substantial changes, immediate substantial changes, a whole series of them. And each of those have their own nature. And so it would be possible, not saying that this is exactly this, it had to have happened, but it would be possible. So it's basically saying that this kind of reasoning is open to the possibility of evolution occurring. So, and there's a big, long explanation of it. So it's open to the possibility of it. And I'm not saying that, therefore, it had to have happened, but it would be possible. All right. So here's another question that goes in. So you're going from fish to lizard. When you're going from there, you have to add information. You're going from something less complex to more complex. So how do you do that? How do you go? Because most of the time, even now when we observe changes, most of the changes are negative. You lose information as time goes on. So how in the world can you gain this information? So here, as you're going from amoeba to dinosaur, you've got increasing information, and it needs a higher cause. And so evolution will claim that there is no higher cause. Well, we know that, there's a higher cause in existence, right? God exists. So if he's the primary cause, he can work through secondary causes to add information in. So it would be open to the possibility of it could occur. I'm not saying it did. I'm not saying that evolution is obviously right then, but I'm saying it's open to the possibility. All right, so there's that answer. Okay. What about go to man? All right, yeah, we're still. So here's the question of, well, if you go from, how do you get from something that's not a man to something that's a man? Like, how could the body even evolve? from something not man to something man. Because if you add a soul to it, it would change the body. So therefore, you can't have a man evolve that way. Because even if you add a soul, it's going to change the body. And so how can you have something not man produce something that's now man with an infused soul? So we go back to our substantial change thing again. So here we've got pre-human, whatever that was. And then you've got your transitions, your series of substantial changes that gets you to human nature. So let's say God infuses the soul there between those two. And the body is also going to have to change. It's right. You can't have, and it's very clear, I think, from the things that Pope John Paul II has said with theology, the body, that our body reveals the inner life of who we are. So if you're going to have this, if there's a process of our body developing from something that isn't human beforehand, when the soul is infused in it, it's going to change the body in a way in which it wasn't before, to accept this. But the soul is this higher cause that can do that. It's a spiritual cause that could change the physical body. And of course, that doesn't say that there can't be any kind of connection to those bodies previously. It's my own way of explaining it. Take it for what it's worth. So here's another objection. How can you have something that's got this nature produce something that's got a nature that is not the same? Isn't that contrary to the way God made it to be? I mean, God made the horse to produce a horse. He didn't make the horse to produce something that's not a horse. So therefore, it seems like it's just, how could this be possible? Well, here's a possible way of looking at it. So everything that exists relates to God in the way in which what it is enables it to do. So God made it what it is. It's got its nature, whatever it is, its horse nature. And so God enables it to relate to him in the way in which that nature allows it to. But everything is related to him because he created it, right? So the rock, it's got a certain nature. It can relate to God. Well, I don't know if you really call it relating to God. Maybe God's the one relating to the rock. So it's very limited in how it could do. And then you go to a plant. A plant, in a sense, is a little bit closer because it actually can live. It's a lot closer to what God is. God is life itself. So that's a little bit closer. Then you go to animals, and animals are they can interact. They can run away. But then you get to man, and we can, in fact, be in relationship with God. So as you see, there's a certain ordering toward, everything is ordered to God, in a sense, but the higher up we go, the better we can relate to him, the better we can be ordered to him. So in a sense, maybe you could describe, well, if something goes from something of a lower order to a higher order, it's actually filling in better what the original nature was meant to do. Each nature is meant to relate to God the best that the thing can. And when you take it from a lower to a higher level, it now can do that relating in a better way. Am I making sense there? Is that kind of deep? Okay. That's one way you could explain it. So it wouldn't necessarily, you could see it's like, okay, that might make sense. Wouldn't necessarily have to be contrary to the way in which God made specific natures for different creatures. All right. And that explains it there. Describes it. All right. One thing, and I mentioned this earlier, whenever we talk about the human evolving, we can't speak about it in the same way in which we speak about biological evolution because of the spiritual soul. We have to take that into account. But that really shouldn't, it's really not a big deal, actually. Even when we go, there's other kinds of evolution that scientists uphold. So you got cosmic evolution, and we kind of got a little bit into that last time about how the universe changes over time. Well, those follow different kinds of rules and processes than biological evolution does. So they're not those two are not the same. Cosmic and biological are not the same. So why does it have to be that biological and human would have to be the same? In fact, we would say no, they're not, because of man's spiritual soul. And we would say any evolution that we're talking about, if we're going to call it evolution, it's not the same thing as biological. All right. And now we get to what you guys have been waiting for. Original sin. All right. This is an easy one. Since it's not apparent how the Church's formulation of original sin can be reconciled with apologetism, therefore we've got to change our doctrine of original sin. For a long time there were a lot of theologians who chose this path. That since it's not compatible and science shows this, we've got to change our doctrine. It's the only way to go. And no, we can't do that. Because what they're basically doing is they're even applying evolution to doctrine. They're saying, biological species change over time. Well, our doctrine's got to change over time. Our way of understanding it may change, but what is fundamentally taught by the Church never changes. God's truth that he's revealed to us in the Church is eternal. It does not change. So we can't do that. And the interesting thing is that if we're trying to show that the two are compatible, we're trying to show apologetism is compatible with original sin, there's no way you're going to show that they're compatible if you change what one of them are, right? If you change what original sin is, you're not going to show their compatibility. You're just going to, it's like, let's make it easier by changing what it is, We'll take away the difficulty and we'll just make it fit, We'll force that square peg into that round hole. And it's like, well, that might make it a lot easier and you might get your solution right away, and there won't be any questions when you're done, but you really haven't solved anything. You just sidestepped the problem. So we can't do that. We can't reformulate it. And we have to remember that this mystery that original sin is produced the fallen world that we see now. Produced what we see, and so it can't be described by the categories in this fallen world, but we can only really talk about it within the biblical terms. And that might grate on us a little because we want to understand it more in those other terms. But we really can't, since it's the event that brought us into the way the world is now. So here's the death one for you. Here's the one on death. So here's the objection. Death is a consequence of the sin of Adam. We believe that. Catechism, right there. Before sin, there was no death. So a developmental creation, evolution, that occurred many years with death of creatures and then new creatures coming after that. Since there was no death before Adam, there could not have been evolution before Adam. So there's the problem, right? So what do we do about that? And so here's a cartoon that actually comes from some of the creationist website, and so this is an argument that they often use. And when you look at it, it needs to be answered. We can't just say that they're you don't interpret the Bible right. No, we have to look at it. So this is what they say. This is evolution. So we've got a bunch of death, and then Adam, and then death. And then this is what the Bible says: no death, death. And then in the future we have no death again with the resurrection in heaven. All right. So, and it seems like you can't put those two together. All right. So here is how we're going to answer that. Well, we know there was at least some death. Man was allowed to eat the plants. So the plants could die because they can't eat the plants if some of the plant doesn't die. So at least plant death had to be there. We don't know anything about animal death because it doesn't say one way or another. So whether or not there was animals that died up to that point. But we do, and in some of their arguments, they argue from the way that death looks. So plant death, when plant dies, It doesn't look horrific, but when an animal dies, there's blood and stuff everywhere, and so it looks a lot worse. And so they put actually animals and people together, and I kind of leery about that because it's like, no, the ontological difference doesn't change it's not between plants and animals, it's between animals and humans, not between those two. There's something about us that's fundamentally different from the animals. So our death is fundamentally different from from what animal death is like. So, when God speaks about the consequence of the sin, he's referring to Adam and Eve having to die. Now, it's possible that we could interpret it and extend it to animals as well, but it's not necessarily there in the Scripture. We kind of have to go beyond what it says. I mean, I think it can be interpreted because the first time we hear about animals dying is after the fall, but it's silent on it beforehand. We don't know. And the other thing is, we know that the church teaches that man was created with this preternatural gift of immortality. So if we hadn't been given this gift by God, we would have been subject to death. It was a gift it wasn't, this preternatural gift is something that's not part of our nature, but it's added on to our nature. So, like, we lost this when we fell. When we sinned, we lost it. Now, if this had been part of our nature from the beginning, and we had lost it, then we'd be something else now. We wouldn't be humans the way God made us. We would be something else. So this couldn't be part of our nature. So our nature, without this gift, actually is subject to death. Just in the same way, we could say, well, animals and plants didn't have that gift. God didn't give them that gift. So we could assume that their nature made them subject to death as well. But the death of man, because of the difference of what we are, we have the spiritual soul. Our death is this. I mean, it may not look outwardly like any different from an animal death, but it's hugely different because it's a tearing apart of body and soul, of the physical and spiritual part of us. That's why when death occurs, it's painful for us because it tears apart who we are, right? We're body and soul together, and they're separated at death, and so it's a huge thing. There's a huge difference. So, do we know that that's for sure the answer to that? No. I mean, we should apply the principle from Job that we had during our scripture lecture, the so you were there principle, to say that I wasn't there, so I don't know for sure, but that would be one way that we could describe it. I mean, it makes sense, I think. You can dispute me on that and say, Father, you don't make any sense at all. And I would be fine. That's okay. All right. Now we go to the Apologenism thing. So macroevolution proves for sure Apologenism happened. It's the way to go. Apologenism, let me describe what that is again. So that basically means that there's multiple sets of first parents. And our problem with that is that the church requires that basically that sin was a personal act of first parents that was then given to all subsequent generations. So you see there, it's not apparent how those two can work. So, does evolution prove that Apologenism is the case? So here were those two different kinds of theories that came. So polycentrism and monocentrism. And what we find is actually that both of these assume Apologenism. So it assumes that this was a group, this was a group, this was a group, this was a group, and they eventually evolved into groups up here. And then over here you've got the out of Africa. But this was an original group. So polygenism. More than one parent in one spot. And science assumes that because it makes the most logical sense to science that there was a larger gene pool there. So there was multiple creatures. Okay, so it's not proving it; it's assuming it. It's part of its theory. So it doesn't necessarily prove it. And in fact, both are in some way open to monogenism. So monogenism, the single set of first human parents. Okay, how are they open? Okay, so let's look at this one first, because this is actually the one that's more relevant today. It's the best theory today. This one is an older one. This one's the one we have now. So you've got this group of pre-humans, whatever they are, and then God can within that group infuse souls into one set of parents within that group, and it basically lifts them up over that discontinuity, and now they're human. All the other ones around them are not human, but they're human. And so, see, a new species, in a sense, has been created because God has infused the soul. But what does science see? Well, science is just going to see that they all basically look the same, right? They can't tell that God's infused the soul there. So, in fact, monocentrism definitely would be open to monogenism, because it can't tell the difference just from fossils and the little fossils that it has if God were to infuse a soul into one single set of parents. And actually the same would be true here. Even if this were part of the it would be more difficult to deal with in certain aspects. But every time you see something in different areas, like if all of these kind of looked like modern man, you couldn't prove in the same way. You can't tell when God infuses the soul, right? So it makes it a little bit more difficult dealing with that, but there could be a possibility too. But right now, what's currently upheld by science is actually quite open to that kind of a thing. So take that for what it's worth. All right. All right, and then we get to one more interesting question. So, if Adam and Eve were only first parents, well, how did they get to be so many of us? There's only two of them. And that's a question that's why science assumes polygenism, because it assumes there's got to be multiple ones so that you can continue. So how could there only be first two? So there's three possibilities that could come out of that. So there were other first parents. That's polygenism. We already kind of crossed that one off. Not that one. Secondly, they propagated with morphologically similar non-humans. For fancy terms. So you've got humans producing offspring with things that are not human. And I think when we think about that, there's just something, we realize kind of intuitive that we're not going to want to go with that one. And then we've got marrying of siblings. When we see that, we don't like that one either, probably. All right, so the first one is out. It's not apparent how it can be reconciled. The second one, there's a couple problems. First one's I would see it's immoral, bestiality. I would not think God would use that for his plan of humankind. Secondly, I think even scientifically it wouldn't work, because you've got this ontological discontinuity, right? You've got something without a human soul and you've got something with a soul, and so producing an offspring between the two, I would guess that that's a big enough difference between the two that you're not going to get fertile offspring from that. I don't know that for sure. I'm not a biologist, but I would guess that probably is not going to work.
But I'm sorry,
Mm-hmm.
interrupt for a
Yeah.
second. But if you're saying that God infuses the soul into one set in a population, and science can't tell the difference, then biologically, why can't? It's not like I wouldn't consider that to be bestiality in the sense that people think about, but that they're all still biological.
True. Well, remember what we also said, the infusion of the soul changes the body in some way. So there's a change that occurs.
Physical.
Yeah, there has to be some kind of physical change. But it's not a kind of physical change in which science would necessarily be able to tell. But I think that even on the biological level, that the kind of offspring is, you're not going to get a viable offspring from that kind of a union. I would guess not. I mean, you could dispute that. I mean, some of these things are my own thoughts. But that would be, I mean, if, for example, you know, in the beetle example, so you've got two different kinds of beetles, and suddenly now they're really close to one another, right? And now they can't produce fertile offspring. So something that has an ontological discontinuity, their whole different level of being in the world, I find it very hard to believe that they would be able to produce fertile offspring. But once again, that's
I'm not seeing that the change once, you know, you're infusing a soul.
Mhm.
It's that physically within an original population.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's been fundamentally changed from those other things around it. Mm-hmm.
Soul in the offspring. Does the soul come from God to each individual person? And so God could choose not to instill a soul in two species that are incompatible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of these kind of questions, they're good things to bring up. I mean, I can't say for sure one way or another because they're just things we don't know. But maybe perhaps you see that as a more likely than this final one of marrying of siblings. Maybe you'd prefer that it occurred through interaction with non-humans rather than siblings. Because actually in the Bible we don't find a prohibition against it until later. Think in Deuteronomy. And Abraham here marries his half-sister, Sarah. So, I mean, it could be a possibility that God allowed that for his plan, but the thing is, with these two, we just don't know. It's another one of those, oh, so you were there kind of things. So, I told you I wasn't going to be able to fully answer all your questions. Yeah.
Another point is that these were all fallen creatures, fallen people. And so questions of immorality are not necessarily prohibited.
Mm-hmm.
I would also add, didn't they all live to be like 700? So they were producing that whole time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. They lived for a long time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the thing is that their families would have been very, very large, probably. You know, Adam and Eve, they never mention all of their children when they mention them in the Bible. They only mention some. So they would have had probably more than just the three sons that we know of. I think it might even say in there that they had other sons and daughters. I'm not sure. It might say that. Yeah.
So the premise that we would have to accept is that incest was not bad in theological ways until they saw that the fact that human beings were born and we have society say we can't have the defects, and that may be one of the things.
Well, yeah, maybe that. See, and you know, this whole thing doesn't really. I mean, I'm not fully satisfied. You know, but I have to admit when I don't know. The one thing that we cannot accept is the first one. You know, my choice is the third over the second, but we cannot accept the first. So that there was multiple sets of parents. So maybe there's other options besides these three, and I'd be happy to include other options if there are.
One quick one. I'm ignorant and didn't know about the half-sister thing. Any more Bible things, half-sister, brother, that you throw out with
That not off the top of my head. Yeah, not off the top of my head. Sorry, but I do know that one. All right. So we've been doing the questions. Any other questions? Okay. So the final thing is the point to make is that there's going to be some unresolved tension here. It's going to be there, partially due to our limits in our own intellects. You know, we're limited in what we know, and there will be even more than just a lot of these kind of questions. We got some kind of answers to. It wasn't, at least I feel, until we get to this very last of the 4 sections, where really some of these questions are really difficult, and we're not fully satisfied with them. But the thing is, even in those other areas, the very first one was allowing reason to be expanded, right? And so right now we have that problem within the scientific realm, is that science is seen as the only thing. And as long as we can't expand that, people around us are not going to be able to understand how faith and something like evolution can go together. Because we need that broader view through reason to be able to understand. And all those things that we were applying don't come from science, and I mean they relate to the faith, but a lot of them come from reason, or philosophical kind of concepts. So insofar as it will be rejected as a way of knowing, then what we understand as Catholics isn't going to be able to be understood in light of evolution. And so, and finally, it's likely that the tension between evolution and original sin is going to be here for a while, I think. Unless there's, a lot smarter people. Benedict XVI, before he became Pope, actually that was one of the things that he had planned on working on, was writing in more detail about evolution, but then he became Pope and that didn't happen. So it would have been interesting to see what he would have written otherwise. But we don't have that luxury to know that. And kind of these last ones, I want to point out some of the things that are kind of harmonious between the two. So science, of course, in order to do science, there's got to be design around. There's a certain directedness of evolution. I mean, even natural selection is directed in a certain way. It's directed to those that survive. I mean, it sounds like it's not directed, but it is. It's a kind of directed mechanism. So there's kind of design direction within it. There's certain low probabilities that occur when you're dealing with very complex organisms, and that also kind of points towards some kind of design. Also, the fact that the world wasn't complete from the beginning, that's something that we teach as a church, that the world was not complete and was continue. That as Catholics, we should expect natural processes to explain a lot, because God made all of those, right? So he works through secondary causes. So that's the ordinary way he works. We wouldn't expect everything to be done miraculously, because then suddenly miracles would become nature. So you need nature there first before you can even recognize a miracle. And then the balance, for some evolutionary theories, especially the more recent ones, balance the chance and more deterministic elements. So it's very Catholic, a balance between necessity and chance. It's very Catholic, both and. The connection between humans and the natural world, but yet a great difference. So that would be something that would be a point. Yeah, we're connected with the rest of the world. God created all of us, created everything that exists, so we're connected in some way. But yet there's an even greater difference between us and the world. Is that the same one? All right. So evolution shows there's natural discontinuities that you can see, where there's seeming like large jumps in the series. They're not sure exactly how those occur even within biological evolution. So it makes sense that there would be this ontological discontinuity. It kind of fits in with what we already see on the biology side of it. So there's a kind of fits together. Of course, science can never show that ontological one. Unable to pinpoint the transition of that ontological discontinuity. Monocentrism being open to monogenism. And just want to finish with the three virtues. As we go forth and we realize our own limitations to be able to understand every question that occurs, but then we've got Pope John Paul II and Archbishop Ravasi gave these three rules / virtues. So the first one is, we're going to continue to have to learn, to know, to do our research. That we have to remain humble. I've got to admit when I don't know things. I got to admit what part of this presentation was me and what part was the church saying. But we also should be optimistic. Just because we can't answer all the questions, if we ourselves don't have the answer, doesn't mean that God doesn't have the answer. So I want to thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Be happy to take any other questions that you have or disputations. And I apologize for going longer.
Those were good.
You stop. No, I stop.